Top leaders of the Bandidos gang have been arrested, two of them, right here in San Antonio.
Houston 2018, 2 gavel strikes, life sentences. Jeffrey Pike and John Portillo, the Bandidos' top leadership, walked into federal court as free men. They left in shackles, murder, racketeering, a biker empire built on violence, finally brought down, case closed, or so it seemed. Fast forward to 2025, FBI raids sweep through Houston again. More than a dozen bandidos in handcuffs, new charges, new evidence, same red and gold patches. But here's the twist. These aren't leftover cases from 2018. This is fresh blood. New leadership, new crimes. The feds thought they'd cut off the head. Instead, they may have just made the beast grow 2 more. Arson attacks, drive-by shootings, a smash-on-sight order that allegedly went nationwide. 7 years after their leaders got life, the Bandidos are back in federal crosshairs. So, what went wrong? Did prosecutors celebrate too early? Or are we watching something more dangerous? A criminal organization that learned how to survive government takedowns? The answer reveals how hard it really is to kill a biker empire. Who the Bandidos are the Bandidos? Motorcycle Club began in 1966 in San Leon, a small town in Galveston County, Texas. Its founder, Donald Mother Chambers, was a Vietnam veteran who wanted a brotherhood that went far beyond weekend riding. What started as a local club quickly took on a darker reputation. Within a few years, the Bandidos had expanded across Texas and into other states, adopting the colors of red and gold and an image of a sombrero-wearing figure that became instantly recognizable in biker culture. By the 1970s and 1980s, chapters were opening not only across the United States, but also overseas, including in Europe and Australia. Law enforcement noted that this wasn't just a riding club anymore. It was an organization with influence stretching across borders. Today, the Department of Justice lists the Bandidos as one of the major outlaw motorcycle gangs in America. Groups they see as national threats because of organized crime, violence, and control over territory. What makes the Bandidos different from many other motorcycle clubs is their Texas identity. Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas became central hubs for the organization, making Texas its stronghold. Federal authorities often point out that this group grew from a regional club into a powerful criminal enterprise, connected to assaults, drug trafficking, and rival conflicts that have spilled into public spaces. In short, the Bandidos aren't just another biker crew. They are one of the most established outlaw clubs in the world, with deep Texas roots and a reputation that still puts them on the Justice Department's radar. RICO in 1 minute. To understand why federal prosecutors keep going after the Bandidos, you have to know what RICO is. RICO stands for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was passed in 1970 to fight organized crime, and it's written into U.S. law at 18 U.S.C., Section 1962. The big idea is simple. If a group acts like a criminal enterprise, then the law can treat it like one. Here's how it works. Under RICO, prosecutors don't have to prove just one crime. They can show a pattern of racketeering activity, things like murder, arson, drug trafficking, extortion, or assaults, committed by people tied to the same organization. Once you prove that pattern, you can connect the acts together and hold leaders responsible, even if they didn't personally pull the trigger or light the fire. Another key part is conspiracy. With RICO, just agreeing to take part in the criminal enterprise can land you with the same charges as the person who carried out the act. That's why prosecutors love RICO for biker gangs and mafia cases. It lets them go after the entire network instead of chasing single incidents. The penalties are heavy. A RICO conspiracy charge alone can bring up to 20 years in prison. If the racketeering involves murder or other violent crimes, sentences can go as far as life. That's exactly why you keep hearing RICO tied to the Bandidos. It's the legal tool that lets the government attack the organization itself, not just individual members. The murder that set the stage. Austin, 2006. On the night of March 18, 2006, Austin, Texas, became the scene of a turning point in outlaw biker history. Anthony Benish, a man trying to start a Hells Angels chapter in the city, had already drawn attention from rival bikers. For the Bandidos, who saw Texas as their stronghold, That move was viewed as a direct challenge. Benesh had been warned more than once. According to court filings, Bandidos members told him to stop wearing Hell's Angels colors and to abandon his plans. But he didn't back down. That evening, outside a North Austin restaurant where he had been eating with his girlfriend and children, Benesh was shot in the head by a sniper's bullet. He collapsed in front of his family, and the shooter escaped into the night. For years, the case went unsolved, but behind the scenes, federal investigators were building evidence. Eventually, in 2017, 4 Bandidos members admitted in court that they took part in carrying out the murder. Their guilty pleas weren't for pulling the trigger alone, but for being part of the organized plan connected to racketeering and violent crimes in aid of the club. The Benesh killing was more than just a murder. It became a cornerstone in later prosecutions. When federal agents brought RICO charges against the Bandidos' national leadership, this case was used as proof that orders for violence came from the top down. In other words, Benesh's death became the clearest example of how the Bandidos enforced their dominance in Texas. The 2017 to 2018 federal strike on leadership. By the mid-2000s, federal agents had spent years documenting how the Bandidos operated. Local shootings, bar fights, and drug cases were just pieces of a larger puzzle. In 2016, the DEA and the Department of Justice brought the puzzle together in a sweeping indictment. At the top of the list were Jeffrey Pike, the Bandidos' national president, and his vice president, John Xavier Portillo. Prosecutors charged them under RICO, accusing them of running the club as a criminal enterprise that used murder, intimidation, and drug trafficking to keep control. The trial that followed was one of the biggest outlaw biker cases Texas had ever seen. Federal prosecutors laid out evidence that the leadership not only knew about the violence, but ordered it. The 2006 murder of Anthony Benesh in Austin was presented as a clear example. Witnesses and records showed that Portillo had given approval for the killing, but Benesh's death was not the only act on the table. The jury also heard about violent clashes with rival motorcycle clubs, especially the Cossacks. In court, prosecutors described what they called a war between the two groups, an ongoing campaign that stretched across multiple Texas cities. Shootings, assaults, and threats of retaliation were all tied into the racketeering case, showing a pattern of organized violence rather than isolated incidents. On May 17, 2018, the jury returned its verdict. Both Pike and Portillo were convicted of RICO conspiracy, murder in aid of racketeering, assault with a dangerous weapon, extortion, and drug trafficking-related charges. The convictions confirmed that the top leadership of the Bandidos was directly linked to a long trail of criminal acts. 4 months later, in September 2018, the sentences came down. Jeffrey Pike, once the national president, received life plus 10 years in federal prison. John Xavier Portillo was given 2 life terms plus 20 years. The punishments effectively guaranteed that neither man would ever walk free again. Federal officials called the case a landmark strike. By removing both the president and vice president, prosecutors hoped they had cut off the head of the Bandidos' organization. The Department of Justice said the verdict proved that outlaw motorcycle gangs could be held accountable the same way as mafia families or drug cartels. Still, even as those life sentences were handed out, law enforcement officers noted that the Bandidos were more than just 2 men. They were a network with hundreds of members across Texas and chapters worldwide. The question that lingered after the 2018 verdict was whether the removal of Pike and Portillo would actually end the cycle of violence, or if the Bandidos would simply reorganize and continue under new leadership. What that strike accomplished and didn't. When the sentences came down in 2018, federal officials celebrated. The Bandidos' top 2 leaders were locked away for life, and on paper, it looked like the organization had been gutted. In many organized crime cases, taking out the head can weaken the whole body. For a moment, it seemed like the same strategy might finally work against Texas's most powerful biker gang, but the reality was more complicated. The Department of Justice has long noted that outlaw motorcycle gangs are not built around a single person. They function as networks of chapters, each with its own officers, members, and supporters. That structure makes them flexible. Even when top leaders are removed, local chapters often keep running, and loyalists can step in to fill the gaps. The Bandidos were no exception. With hundreds of members across Texas and thousands worldwide, the group had deep roots and a culture that didn't disappear just because two men were gone. The convictions of Jeffrey Pike and John Portillo showed that the government could reach the top, but they didn't erase the enterprise itself. Within months of the life sentences, reports of Bandidos' activity continued, from small-town bar fights to ongoing rivalries. Law enforcement agencies pointed out that the group's identity, as Texas-born and fiercely territorial, gave it resilience. In other words, the strike hit hard, but it didn't kill the engine. The Bandidos framework survived, and federal investigators knew the story wasn't over. The landscape 2019 onward, Houston turns hot. After the 2018 convictions, many assumed the Bandidos might retreat, regroup quietly, or even lose ground. Instead, by 2019, federal filings say the group was once again in the middle of open conflict, this time in Houston. According to the Department of Justice, the spark came from clashes with another organization known as BEAST. What began as a rivalry over territory escalated into a violent turf war. Court records describe the level of aggression as more than just local feuds. Prosecutors allege that the Bandidos' leadership gave a smash-on-sight order, meaning members were expected to attack rivals whenever they crossed paths. That directive, if proven in court, shows how violence was woven into the group's operating strategy, not just used in rare situations. From there, Houston saw a steady stream of incidents linked to the rivalry. Federal prosecutors say shootings took place in public settings, sometimes with bystanders caught nearby. This wasn't hidden violence on the edges of town. It was gunfire erupting in spaces where families and civilians could have been present. Investigators pointed to those events as proof of how reckless and dangerous the gang's war had become. What makes the post-2019 period stand out is how visible it was. For years, the Bandidos had operated in a way that outsiders might have missed unless they were inside biker circles. But in Houston, violence spilled out of the shadows. Bars, restaurants, and even parking lots became crime scenes. Each confrontation pushed the group further into the sights of law enforcement. The Department of Justice framed these clashes as evidence that the Bandidos weren't slowing down after the loss of their national president and vice president. Instead, chapters in Texas kept enforcing dominance through fear and force. The alleged smash-on-sight directive, especially, suggested a deliberate choice to escalate rather than step back. For the public, this meant Houston became the new front line of outlaw motorcycle gang activity. For federal agents, it meant the Bandidos case wasn't finished. The violence from 2019 onward set the stage for a new indictment, one that would aim not only at individuals, but at the structure of the club itself in Houston. The Houston RICO case, what's alleged? On February 19, 2025, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Texas revealed the latest strike against the Bandidos. A grand jury returned a 22-count indictment naming 14 members and associates tied to the gang's Houston area chapters. According to the Department of Justice, the charges reached across the map of violent crime: murder, attempted murder, assaults, arson, firearms offenses, and cocaine distribution. One chapter at the center of the indictment was the so-called Welcome to Hell chapter, a local unit accused of carrying out attacks in Houston's bar and club scene. Prosecutors allege that members used these attacks not only to retaliate against rivals, but also to send a clear signal: Houston remained Bandidos territory. The scale of the allegations was striking. The indictment painted the picture of a criminal enterprise that still had a broad reach. The DOJ estimated the Bandidos' strength at 1,500 to 2,000 members across the United States, with another 1,000 to 1,500 members overseas. Those numbers reinforce the idea that even with leadership removed years earlier, the group remained one of the most entrenched outlaw motorcycle gangs in the world. Two names in the indictment drew particular attention: Brandon "Loco" Hance, also known as Gun Drop, was charged with arson connected to the burning of a bar outside Houston. Prosecutors alleged that the firebombing was part of the Bandidos' wider strategy to intimidate rivals and control local nightlife spots. Then there was David Breakcheck Vargas, also called First Time. Vargas was accused of murder in aid of racketeering, one of the most serious charges possible under federal organized crime laws. Both men, along with the others named, were portrayed in the indictment as acting in line with the club's violent code. It's important to underline that these are allegations, not convictions. In the American legal system, every defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty in court. The indictment is simply the starting point for the case, not the final word. Trials, evidence, and verdicts will determine guilt or innocence. The announcement of the charges wasn't kept behind closed doors. The Department of Justice released a public video briefing, and multiple local and national news outlets streamed coverage. In those press conferences, prosecutors described the indictment as part of a long-term effort to keep Houston safe from gang violence. They emphasized the use of RICO laws to tie the alleged acts together, showing a pattern of crime rather than treating each shooting or fire as a random event. For the public, the details were chilling. The charges suggested not just isolated bar fights or small disputes, but an organized pattern of violence and intimidation. From murder and attempted murder to drug trafficking and arson, the scope of the allegations reminded many that the Bandidos remained a force in Houston, despite earlier strikes at their leadership. For federal authorities, the 2025 indictment marked the next chapter in a battle stretching back decades. After all, the Bandidos had survived past prosecutions before. Now the question was whether this sweep, aimed at a chapter-level network, could slow down an organization with such deep roots in Texas culture and such a broad international presence. Incidents cited in the charging documents: Houston area. The 2025 indictment doesn't just list broad categories like murder or arson. It breaks those charges down into specific incidents, many of them drawn from Houston's nightlife scene. Court papers describe how Bandidos members allegedly carried out barroom assaults, shootings, and even targeted killings as part of their effort to drive rival clubs out of the area. One hotspot repeatedly mentioned was the Hog Stop Bar in East Houston. According to local reporting, this location became a flashpoint, where confrontations between bikers escalated into violence. Another was the Blue Bayou Cafe, a popular hangout that prosecutors say turned into the site of gunfire tied to the ongoing turf war. In both places, civilians were nearby when bullets started flying, an example of how these conflicts spilled far beyond club rivalries and into public danger. Perhaps the most dramatic incident named in the indictment happened in December 2023. The County Line Ice House, a bar in Porter, Texas, was burned to the ground. Federal prosecutors charged Brandon Loco Hance, also known as Gun Drop, with arson in aid of racketeering. According to the filing, the firebombing wasn't random. It was meant as a warning and a show of force, signaling that businesses seen as siding with rivals could pay the price. The destruction of the County Line Ice House underlined how violent tactics extended beyond biker-on-biker clashes into outright attacks on property. Each of these incidents is tied into the larger RICO case. On their own, a bar fight, a shooting, or an arson might be prosecuted as isolated crimes. But under RICO, prosecutors argue they form a pattern of racketeering activity, carried out by members of the same enterprise, the Bandidos. That's why the indictment strings together years of violent events across Houston, from assaults with dangerous weapons to murder in aid of racketeering. The Department of Justice also noted that this case wasn't built in isolation. It was part of a larger strategy under OCDETF, the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Forces, and Project Safe Neighborhoods. These programs are designed to combine federal prosecutors, the DEA, the FBI, ATF, and local law enforcement into a single effort. By pooling resources, the government can handle cases that cut across city lines and involve multiple layers of organized crime. The Bandidos indictment is one example of how those partnerships come together in practice. For Houston residents, the incidents listed in the charging documents show how visible the turf war had become. Bars, restaurants, and roadside businesses weren't just backdrops. they became battlegrounds. For prosecutors, those violent acts created the evidence they needed to argue that the Bandidos were still functioning as a criminal enterprise long after their top leaders were taken down. In the end, the indictment is about more than just 14 names. It's a snapshot of how an outlaw motorcycle gang allegedly used violence and intimidation to hold its ground in one of Texas's biggest cities, and how federal prosecutors are trying once again to shut them down. Why RICO fits these prosecutions. The reason you keep hearing the word RICO in cases like this is because it's uniquely designed for situations where violence and crime aren't just random, they're part of a system. Under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, prosecutors don't need to prove that one person committed every crime. Instead, they can aggregate acts carried out by different members over time and show how those acts serve the same criminal enterprise. That's a powerful tool when you're dealing with groups like the Bandidos. On their own, a bar fight in 2021, a shooting in 2022, and an arson in 2023 might look like separate, unrelated events. But with RICO, prosecutors can argue that these are connected pieces of the same pattern, all done to protect territory, intimidate rivals, and generate profit for the club. It also allows them to reach across years and chapters. Even if the incidents happened in different parts of Houston or involved different members, RICO ties them together under the idea of one ongoing criminal organization. That's why the law is often compared to a net. It catches not just the individual actors, but the structure that directs them. For prosecutors, that means they can hold leaders accountable for giving orders and hold foot soldiers accountable for carrying them out, all within the same case. And for outlaw motorcycle gangs, it means every act of violence can become evidence of something larger than just a single crime, where the law draws the lines and the penalties. Federal law treats crimes tied to organized enterprises with some of the harshest penalties on the books. Take VICAR, violent crimes in aid of racketeering. If prosecutors prove a murder was carried out to advance the interests of a gang, the punishment can be either mandatory life in prison or even the death penalty. That's why charges like the one against David Breakcheck Vargas stand out. They're not just murder charges, they're VICAR murder charges, carrying the highest possible stakes. On the other hand, RICO conspiracy charges on their own carry up to 20 years in federal prison. But if the underlying crimes include murder, drug trafficking, or other high-level felonies, those penalties can climb even higher. That's where the stacking effect comes in. Federal firearms laws can add 5, 10, or more years, depending on the weapon and how it was used. Arson statutes can tack on an additional 10 to 20 years. When these charges are combined in a single indictment, it means that even mid-level members can face decades behind bars if convicted. The strategy is clear. Use the toughest statutes to create the broadest exposure, and then leverage that pressure to dismantle the entire enterprise. Status check. Convictions versus allegations. At this point, it's important to separate what has been proven from what is still only alleged. In 2018, the federal strike on the Bandidos' national leadership ended with final convictions. Jeffrey Fay Pike and John Xavier Portillo were found guilty by a jury and sentenced to life in prison. Those verdicts are not in question, they are settled outcomes. By contrast, the 2025 Houston case is still in its early stages. The indictment lays out 22 counts against 14 defendants, but an indictment is not evidence. Each of the accused men is presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in court. Trials, not press conferences, will decide whether the government's allegations stand. That distinction matters. The story of the Bandidos is partly about what has been proven, and partly about what federal prosecutors are still trying to prove. Outro Plus, Call to Action. A leadership takedown in 2018, a chapter-level RICO sweep in 2025. Are we watching the slow unraveling of a Texas powerhouse, or the start of a new cycle of violence? The next hearings, the next verdicts, and the future of this gang's grip on Houston are still to come. If you want the inside details on how the courtroom battles play out, and how prosecutors keep using RICO to target outlaw motorcycle gangs, make sure to subscribe. That way, You won't miss the follow-up as this story continues to unfold.